Hi, this presentation is entitled Social Classes and Social Cognition in Capitalism, the Intertwining of Social Institutions and Human Ethology. Its goal is to understand to what extent innate contents present in human cognition and fixed by natural selection interact with cultural institutions, producing the social reality we know. My main goal is to offer a sound solution to the dilemma between a social biological approach, which emphasizes ethology as the primary driver of human behavior, even in complex societies, and conventional social history. We believe that big history, through its play of historical scales, offers an elegant solution to this dilemma, as it allows us to simultaneously take human ethology and human culture into account. The question I will pose in this presentation is as follows. What's the relationship between a class for itself and the way human beings conceive the idea of belonging to that social class? In other words, is there an evolutionary and cognitive aspect to acting politically as a member of a social class? Just to use the Marxist jargon, do capitalists and proletarians employ their social cognitive algorithms fixed by natural selection over 6 million years in the distant past to make sense of the fact of belonging to a social class in a market-based capitalist society? How are collective action, class consciousness, and class solidarity produced? We're not asking here what are the actual production relations responsible for creating classes in themselves in a capitalist society. What we are asking is what kind of mental processes are recruited when someone is trying to understand and make meaning of their class condition and to act politically according to this understanding. In other words, are the last 6 million years in the evolution of primate social cognition and the history of capitalist economic institutions in the last 3 centuries related? According to Marx, social classes are defined by the relationship individuals have to the means of production, which refers to the resources and tools necessary for producing goods and services in a society. In Marxist theory, there are two primary classes, the capitalist class and the proletariat. The capitalists are the owners of the means of production, such as factories, land and capital. They control and accumulate wealth through the exploitation of labor. The proletariat, on the other hand, is the working class, who do not own the means of production and are forced to sell their labor power to the capitalist class in exchange for a wage. Marx argued that the relationship between the capitalist class and the proletariat is inherently exploitative. The capitalist system, he believed, relies on the extraction of surplus value from the labor of the proletariat. In the works of Marx, the concept of class in itself and class for itself are used to describe different stages of class consciousness and organization within capitalist societies. Class in itself refers to the objective economic and social position of individuals within the capitalist mode of production. It's determined by a person's relationship to the means of production, in other words, whether they own the means of production, the capitalist class, or sell their labor, the proletariat. In this sense, a class in itself exists independently of individuals' awareness or participation in organized action. A class for itself represents a higher stage of class consciousness and organization. It occurs when members of a particular class recognize their shared interests, unite, and actively strive for the transformation of society for the benefit of their class. A class for itself emerges when individuals become aware of their collective power and act in solidarity to promote their class interests. The capitalist class is already a class for itself, in the sense that it's fully conscious of its position and interests in the existing economic system. It possesses economic resources, political influence, and control over the means of production, allowing it to exert power and shape society according to its interests. On the other hand, the proletariat is expected to develop class consciousness and become a class for itself, and as more and more collective actions are promoted by proletarian organizations such as unions and parties. Of course, in a technological, informational, and Uberized society, this may sound like a dream. But if it sounds that way, it's only because the capitalist mode of production has been dramatically transformed in the last 30 years. The potential for proletarian class consciousness, at least in its cognitive basis, lives on. So let's try to understand what leads one to consider oneself as a member of a social class and to act according to certain social expectations. A shared economic experience regarding social exclusion, inclusion, quality of life, political participation, and, of course, owning or not owning the means of production. All of this is the input information into a system of complex cognitive decisions in a capitalist society. But the type of information with the power to activate evolutionary social cognition changes at the frequency of cultural history, which means that throughout the history of Homo sapiens as a species, information of different natures has been culturally selected to convey and signal status positions. This fine-tuning variation does not occur among common chimpanzees, the most likely representative of the last common ancestor of hominins. As far as we know, chimpanzees' social cognition is sort of programmed to grasp a stereotyped set of social information as signals of status position. Both bonobos and their closest evolutionary relatives, the common chimpanzees, have complex social cognitive domains empowered by a sophisticated theory of mind. But it seems that the environmental conditions in which they evolved did not allow these organisms to develop a cognitive apparatus that responded to a more flexible range of input information. This is the magic of the transdominial mind of Homo sapiens, for better or worse. Not only can stereotyped cognitive algorithms be combined, temporarily suppressed, or overexpressed, but they also become responsive to cultural information, produced not in the extremely long duration, but in the Braudelian longue durée, in the secular or millennial rhythm of cultural mentalities and institutions. Cultural selection is an evolutionary game changer for Homo sapiens. It allows ultra-fast environmental adaptation, mostly without genetic change. It uses innate, genetic, and programmed behavior in flexible and rapidly changing environments. It's a faster than genes mechanism of adaptation that does not eliminate innate and hardwired cognitive algorithms and biases, but depends on them. Uh, in general, we can say that natural selection has driven chimpanzees, and probably the last common ancestor of all hominins, to develop a complex set of cognitive and behavioral mechanisms designed to regulate in-group interactions with conspecifics. Of course, this does not mean that status struggles and inequalities in reproductive and energetic opportunities are suppressed. Quite the opposite seems to be the case. The primary driver of these kinds of behavioral regulation mechanisms is the highly dynamic and fluid social system in which chimpanzees live. This is the predicament of social species with highly individualized cognition. Unless functional mechanisms for the prevention of intragroup lethal aggression emerge, permanent societies are impossible. And permanent social groups are efficient solutions against the threat posed by predators, by other conspecific groups, in the task of foraging, etc. Chimpanzees recognize group members using the memory of past interactions between the observer and a third party. Kinship relations are usually involved mainly because male chimpanzees tend to stay in their birth group and form strong coalitions. Females tend to migrate from one group to another when they reach reproductive age, but they also form coalitions, especially with their underaged children, although they are less permanent and strong than those of males. There are no stable status positions in chimpanzee societies. Although not all chimpanzees strive with the same dedication to ascend in the status structure, the path is open to all, at least theoretically. And to paraphrase Norbert Elias, when he talked about the court society in the 17th century Europe, those who do not rise will fall, in a clear zero-sum game. However, far from fantasies about a state of nature in which life is nasty, brutal, and short, chimpanzees do not seem to need a social contract. Their minds are empowered by a sophisticated social cognition domain. This domain is not only responsible for their keen abilities in terms of understanding the intentions of others and constructing hypotheses about the best course of action to win the race for status. The social cognitive domain also imposes limits to the struggle for status, preventing a full-blown lethal escalation. The struggle between two opponents aiming to rise in status or to preserve their current privileges is somewhat ritualized. There is a clear relationship between the ability to form coalitions and success rates. The more friends a chimp has, the more he is expected to move the social ladder. These friends are not just spectators, they get indirectly involved in the political campaign. They provide emotional support. They act to prevent the opponent from interrupting the socializing activities between their preferred candidate and other group members. And the fight tends to end when one of the competitors acknowledges his defeat, especially when most of the group members rally around the opponent. Of course, it does not happen in a single event, but in a sequence of interactions that can take months to conclude. In the meantime, chimpanzees use all their social skills to outwit their opponents, investing in new alliances, socializing with children and their mothers, and showing brute force and irreverence in the face of demands to perform rituals of submission on the part of those who currently hold a status position. And all of these occur amid rare incidents of lethal aggression. Of course, sometimes we may not be able to pull the punch at the right moment, and as we know, accidents happen. But there should be no reason why chimpanzees cannot engage in an all-out warfare, turning their in-group opponents into enemies, except for ethological triggers that diffuse a lethal aggression before it gets out of hand. But note that these ethological safety mechanisms are activated only when interaction occurs between members of an in-group. And how do chimpanzees know this? How do they know that they are interacting with people who are members of their own group? Remember that their neocortical development allows for a very powerful social mind capable not only of producing complex social behaviors, but also of recording past interactions and current status positions. And if you are registered in a chimpanzee social mind as someone in the social pyramid, regardless of your actual status position, then you are an in-group member. And if you are an in-group member, whether low or high status, all the behavioral mechanisms for avoiding lethality will be called into effect. As a consequence, interactions with individuals whose identity, history, and current status positions are not registered in the memory buffer of the social mind do not trigger lethality prevention mechanisms. There's an ongoing debate on this topic, but there seems to be a relationship between population pressure and cognitive processing capacity, meaning that when chimpanzee groups become too densely populated, each member's social cognition is under unbearable pressure to process all the information regarding the current status structure and past interactions with and between group members. A good metaphor would be that, like computer processors, social minds undergo an unsafe overclock. Before overheating melts the processors, a group of chimpanzees splits in two, with a no man's or no chimp's land between them. The split flushes the social memory and causes social cognition to return to homeostasis. After that, as days and months go by, the interactions between members of two groups do not trigger the lethality prevention mechanisms. And what we see is the disturbing phenomenon first documented by Jane Goodall and confirmed by many other primatologists thereafter. Chimpanzee groups start engaging in violent intersocial and coalitional interactions without the lethality prevention and without the lethality prevention ethology activated, their minds give them some kind of a weapons-free order and they can kill enemies on sight. And how do their minds tag a conspecific as an enemy? First, they identify the other chimpanzee as a conspecific using sensorial information. For example, passing baboons are just ignored, they are not the enemy. Second, they cannot find any information regarding the current rank and past interactions of the identified individual because the social memory was flushed after the split. Once the information cannot be retrieved, the individual does not belong to the observer's social pyramid and therefore can and probably will be little engaged. So let's turn to Homo sapiens and try to understand how chimpanzee's social mind can be a proxy for the last common ancestor of all hominins, and how the human mind deals with all these evolutionary archetypes that are still present in its collective unconscious. Only after that can we address the relationship between social classes and social cognition. How do humans mentally conceive the groups they belong to as in-groups? Homo sapiens is endowed with a cognitive architecture that enables these animals to recruit in creative ways their ethological algorithms to make meaning of different objects and relationships. This means that for every identity role a human is asked to play, the transdominial mind will recruit the same ethological algorithms. Every object, including people, with certain cultural markers will be tagged as a member of the status pyramid, therefore activating pro-social algorithms to mediate social relationships. This is very different from how the chimpanzee's mind works. While in most primates, behavioral and cognitive algorithms tend to be activated by sensorial exposure to more or less stereotyped set of input information, in Homo sapiens, a virtually unlimited range of information types and sources can be used by the transdominial mind to activate ethological algorithms. There are indeed primitive cognitive modules in the human mind that are also activated by stereotyped information, but they tend to produce simple behaviors. Yawning contagion is an example. After the emergence of modern human cognition, the most complex algorithms are highly prone to cultural activation. And if this were not so, it would make no sense to speak of behavioral modernity. Remember that culture is a faster than genes mechanism of adaptation, but it does not supplant human ethology. On the contrary, it depends on it. Both class consciousness and the idea of a class for itself must be read as a result of human social cognition. Through socialization and political indoctrination, humans in class societies can be taught to activate their pro-social algorithms whenever they recognize the appropriate class signals. Narratives and myths are necessary structures for creating trust, identity, and a sense of belonging in the process of class inculcation. This means that among the recognized members of a class, a hierarchy of status is expected to emerge based on prestige, charisma, political power expressed by one's coalition and alliances with other powerful individuals, and/or wealth. The mind of a class-conscious human being is instructed by the social cognitive domain to suppress the expression of antisocial behavior toward in-group members, and to treat out-group members as enemies. Remember that when social cognition algorithms tag an individual or a group of individuals as enemies, lethal aggressive interactions are no longer suppressed. The escalation of lethal violence in revolutionary and counter-revolutionary processes depends not only on the actions of institutional agents, but also on a greater tolerance for lethality against members of an outgroup, demonstrated by people who are not actually engaged in the political struggle. When class struggle takes place in highly institutionalized environments, such as modern functioning democracies, legal systems and social control mechanisms may discourage the open expression of tolerance for lethal violence. But human ethology finds its way. Remember that lethal aggression is not the product of some killer instinct, as many anthropological fantasies in the West claimed. Lethal aggression is only one possible outcome of social interactions that are not governed by pro-social algorithms. For example, most encounters between chimpanzees of different groups result in nothing more than threats followed by flight. This means that what we need to ask is whether a given interaction between cognitive agents actually induces pro-social behavior or not. And this is a function of the categorization of an agent as an in-group or an out-group individual. Pro-sociality involves reciprocity, fairness, and aggression control. Interactions that are not managed by pro-social algorithms are unlikely to obey these rules. Therefore, when we think of class struggle in a highly institutionalized settings, we might expect the voluntary suppression of lethal aggression in response to law enforcement and social control, but not the suppression of legally sanctioned antisocial behavior. For example, the adoption of double standards when judging the morality of actions committed by members of an opposing social class as compared to the judgment applied to actions promoted by members of one's own class. To sum up, we can say that 1. A class for itself emerges only as the product of social cognition. The input information used to cognize the in-group comes from the cultural and economic background. The cognitive image of an in-group needs to be maintained, or it can be dismantled, making room in the social mind for other competing in-group images, nations, religions, etc. Once inculcation reaches a critical point, a class-conscious Homo sapiens tends to engage in pro-social interactions with his in-group peers and anti-social interactions with out-group individuals, as far as institutional means of control permit. An in-group cognition leads agents to view as pro-social, which means just, fair, and necessary, the values that provide identity for one's own group, and to view as antisocial the values that identify all out-groups. Thank you very much.